and Robin and Brian for
this meeting is being recorded.
Okay, hang on, let's just share the screen. Oh, hang on. Yeah. Where is my? So sorry, I'm having trouble sharing my presentation here.
We can see it now.
You can see it, good. Okay. All right, there we go. Yeah, so thanks very much for the invitation to talk today. So colour, as we all know, is ubiquitous. So if we look at this scene here, there's a huge amount of colour cues, and colour is infiltrating many aspects of our perception and our cognition. For example, you can see that colour is used for distinguishing objects, so telling the difference between the lime and the lemon, or the properties of objects, so being able to know that these bananas are ripe or not ripe to eat. Also, statistical regularities in colour give us cues about the illumination and also scenes. So, for example, here we can tell from the colour of the leaves what season this photograph was taken in, and we might be able to estimate the time of day based on the colour of the illumination. Colour is also used for communication, so we group colours into categories, like my daughter has done here, and we give those categories terms and use those to efficiently communicate about objects. So, for example, pass me the green one or pass me the blue one. And of course, we have strong affective responses to colour, strong preferences that have a role in art and design and aesthetics. So in the talk today, I'm going to outline what we know about the development of colour perception. And what I aim to do is to illustrate that a developmental approach is useful not only for understanding how infants and children see and think about and interact with the world around them, but also how a developmental approach might give some insight into the underlying mechanisms of mature colour perception in adults as well. So just to start with, as we know, in the majority of human observers, colour vision is trichromatic. So by this we mean that there's three classes of retinal cone photoreceptors that are maximally sensitive to short, medium and long wavelengths of light. And these give rise to two neural pathways, the so-called cone-opponent retinogeniculate pathways. So these connect the retina and the lateral geniculate nucleus and then feed on to the visual cortex. And there's two of these pathways that result from combining and contrasting signals from these cones. So one pathway here, the S-axis or cardinal axis, people refer to as the blue-yellow pathway, but it actually is more equivalent to violet chartreuse in appearance. And then there's another axis, this LLM axis, which people refer to as the red-green axis, but it's more like cherry teal in appearance. But the basic point is that there's these two neural subsystems that are coding colour in this opponent fashion. And then we know that there's many regions of the brain that are responsive and selective to colour. So, for example, multiple regions of visual cortex and ventral visual pathway have got different cell types that encode colour in different ways and lead to different forms of colour representation. So there's been a lot of research on the development of trichromatic colour vision, and there's a nice paper here by Davida Teller, a review of all of the psychophysical studies, or the early psychophysical studies. I think there might be someone who just needs to mute their microphone, sorry. All of the early psychophysical studies looking at colour vision in infants. In a nutshell, newborn infants do have some colour vision, but it's highly limited. So colour will need to be covering a large amount of space, be highly saturated, and newborn infants can only see some hues such as red. And actually, trichromatic colour vision takes a couple of months to develop. So we know this, for example, from this study here. So this is a VEP study, a visual evoked potentials, where you're measuring electrical activity from the visual cortex at the back of the head in response to infants being shown these gratings, these stripy chromatic contrast patterns. And what you've got here is these lines represent the neural activity in response to an infant being shown the grating. And you can see that as time goes on, as the child gets older, then there's more and more response to the chromatic stimulus. And for the red-green gratings, you get a neural response from around about 4 to 6 weeks old. But for blue-yellow, it's actually later, around about 6 to 8. And the general consensus is that infants are actually trichromatic by about 2 to 3 months old. Now, once you have trichromatic colour vision, your sensitivity actually continues to improve all the way up until late adolescence. So this is a nice study by Ken Knobloch and colleagues, where they showed humans of all ages a chromatic stimulus, which were these chromatic bars. It's just embedded in some luminance noise. And the infants, their looking was recorded, and adults had to choose which side the chromatic stimulus was on. And they estimated something called a saturation threshold, which is the amount of saturation or the intensity of the colour that was needed for the observer to be able to actually locate the chromatic stimulus. And so here what you see is chromatic threshold plotted against age. And you can see that as we get older throughout childhood, sensitivity to colour improves, reaches the best point around about late adolescence, and then the bad news is it starts to get slowly worse again. So this protracted maturation has been shown in a lot of studies, but actually the reason for this is less well known. It's still unclear. So we've measured saturation thresholds in infants in order to investigate whether infant sensitivity to colour relates to the colour of the environment. Now, colour has got all kinds of statistical regularities in illumination and in natural scenes. So here, for example, if you look at these images, it's the same image taken at various times of the day. And you can see that the illumination changes from a bluish to a yellowish light as the day unfolds. Now, if you plot the chromaticity of the pixels, you get this line in that kind of colour space. And it connects colours that are bluish or yellowish in appearance. So we call that the daylight axis. And also, if you plot the pixels, the chromaticity of pixels in natural scenes, then they also form this cloud that elongates along the natural daylight axis, or this blue-yellow axis. Now, we know from several studies that adult sensitivity to colour also relates to this daylight blue-yellow axis. So here we've got some data that we collected from adults, and their saturation thresholds for 8 hues was measured. So each hue is plotted here in the colour space, and the distance from the central point tells you how intense that colour needs to be for the adult to be able to detect it. And when you plot an ellipse, you can see that it elongates, it stretches along this blue-yellow natural daylight axis. So in other words, adult sensitivity to colour is related to the statistical regularity of colour in our natural world. And we've shown recently that for 4 to 6 month old infants, when you measure their saturation thresholds, then you get the same pattern of elongation. So there's several possibilities here. So one is that our colour vision has evolved to be optimal for representing the natural world over evolution. And another possibility, which I think is potentially more exciting, is that colour vision is actually calibrating to the environment when trichromatic colour vision is developing. So infants are tuning up to the environment that they find themselves in so they can optimally represent what they're perceiving. And I'm currently leading a 5-year project funded by the European Research Council, where we're further investigating the relationship of colour perception and colours in natural scenes. So one set of studies is a set of cross-cultural studies where we're capturing the visual diet, so the chromaticities that people live in and are exposed to by people wearing head-mounted cameras. And we're also doing hyperspectral imaging. And we're doing this for people living in different environments. So people living in the Ecuadorian rainforest, in urban areas, in the Arctic, and also in environments where there's a lot of seasonal change in the chromaticity. And then we're also measuring with a battery of psychophysical tasks people's colour perception, so we can establish whether differences in an individual's environment are reflected in their colour perception on these tasks. And the specific hypothesis related to today's talk is there any evidence that colour vision tunes to your own environment during development when trichromatic colour vision is being learnt? So I said at the beginning of the talk that colour is useful for identifying the properties of objects and their scenes. You can see here that as soon as you see in colour, you can identify which of the berries are ripe and which ones are unripe. There's lots of questions about the development of this aspect of our colour perception, huge amount of questions about it. It's relatively poorly understood. In particular, understanding what infants are sensitive to in a scene and whether they encode the colours of scenes and use that to recognise scenes has been very little investigated. And we've just started to investigate this. So this study here is a study where we're looking at what aspects of a scene infants are sensitive to, what chromatic statistics or chromatic properties are infants sensitive to when they look at a scene. And this study was done in the pandemic. So we designed a protocol where we could test babies over Zoom, and we had parents show stimuli on an iPad. So we color calibrated all the different models of iPads, and infants were shown pairs of scenes. So they were either urban or rural scenes to the left and the right of their midpoint. And I've just got this little clip here so you can see it's actually quite easy to work out whether the infant's looking left or right. And you can see that they appear to have clear preferences for looking at the stimuli. So what we do with this data is we code it frame by frame. It's quite laborious to total up how long it is that an infant will look at various types of scenes. And then we analyze the images for their chromatic and spatial properties. So here what you can see is the chromaticity of all the pixels in this image plotted into that cone opponent space. And you can see it forms a cloud. It's actually typical for natural scenes, this image, because it forms this cloud along the daylight axis. And we've done the same for this image down here. And then we're also analysing various spatial properties. So here, for example, we're calculating the edge density of this image as well. And what we find is that 90% of the variance in how long infants look at an image can be explained by a combination of the chromatic and the spatial properties of the scene. And in particular, infants are particularly driven by how saturated the scene is and how much chromatic contrast there is. I should say also actually that we're just starting to apply this method to look at infants' response to art and to see what chromatic properties of art infants are sensitive to. There's also evidence that by 6 months, infants are aware of the colour of objects and that they have a sense of the colour that objects typically arise in. So, for example, in this study by Kimura and colleagues, they paired objects either in the correct colour or the inverted colour. So, for example, infants saw yellow bananas paired with blue bananas. And then they just recorded how long infants looked at those stimuli. And what they found was that at 5 months, infants didn't look longer at the correctly coloured objects, but by 6 months and on, they started having this preference for the correctly coloured object when it was a face or fruit, but not when it was a flower. And the authors argued that infants aren't looking longer at the correctly coloured flowers, because flowers can occur in so many different colours, but faces and fruit are more specific in the colours that they can appear in, and the infants are tuning into this at just 6 months. So it's quite remarkable, really, that by 6 months, when you think of how young a 6-month-old infant is, that they're actually have a sense of what colour objects should be appearing in. There's also evidence to suggest that at 2 years, the children have got a conceptual knowledge of colour. So in this study, what they did was they played children a word, an object word like strawberry. And then following this, they showed 2 objects. And one of them was colour congruent with the word and the other one wasn't. So here, the colour congruent one is red because strawberries are red. And the yellow one it is not congruent. And what they found was that 2-year-olds would actually look longer at the colour congruent object than the incongruent one after hearing a word, even before they actually know colour terms. So it suggests that when you have a 2-year-old and they're hearing object words, they're actually hearing those words in colour, they're associating those words with colour, and that affects their visual preference when the objects are shown later. Now, in order for you to be able to use colour for object perception or recognition, you need to have colour constancy. And colour constancy is the ability to keep colour perceptually constant even under changing illumination. So a banana under blue light doesn't look blue. We keep the colour of the banana roughly yellow even under varying illumination. And there's been only a few studies looking at the development of colour constancy. So there's thousands in adults and lots of investigation into how the visual system manages to do this, how it manages to discount the illuminant, but very few developmental studies. So there's studies by Danner, Miller and Yang, which suggests that 4-month-old infants have got a rudimentary form of colour constancy. And there's also this study that we conducted with 2- and 3-year-olds, where we measure colour constancy at that age. So to measure it, we made the experiment into a game about dressing bears with coloured trousers. And the child is taught that the 2 bears must always wear the same coloured trousers, so exactly the same. And once they've got this idea with a training game, they're then given a light booth with 2 halves, one illuminated with natural simulated daylight and the other one with reddish light. And the experimenter puts their bear in one half and puts the trousers on their bear, and then the child has to choose the coloured trousers that match the experimenter's bear's trousers. And so they have 4 options. So one is cut from the same card. So that's actually this one here. And that would be the colour constant choice. So the camera here isn't colour constant, so it looks different, but actually because of the illuminant, but actually these 2 are cut from the same card. And then there's also a metameric light match. So these are ones that have been printed to measure with a colorimeter identically under the 2 illuminants. So that would be your not colour constant choice, and then there's various distractors in between. And so we play this game with different targets and distractors for multiple trials to give them a colour constancy score. And we also measured their colour naming and comprehension to see how advanced they were in their colour term knowledge. What we find is that for 2- to 3-year-olds, there's actually a huge amount of variation in their colour constancy. So some children were pretty much perfect in colour constancy in this task, whereas others were very poor. Now, this variation doesn't relate to age. It also doesn't relate to how well the children do the task when there's no illumination change, so just pure discrimination. But what it does relate to is how well children name and point to the colours, how advanced their colour naming is. So the more colour constant you are, the better your colour naming if you're a 2- and 3-year-old. Now, this relationship could go in either way. So it could be that learning the words for colour helps you keep colour perceptually constant because you've got an anchor, you've got a stable referent. It could also be that being more colour constant helps you learn the words for colour, because you've got more constant surface, so there's less changing all the time, so it enables you to just have a more stable surface to map the term onto. There's also a recent study where we asked children to group colours into families, and they did this on multiple times under different illuminations. And at 2 to 3 years old, children's colour categories are actually remarkably stable under different illumination. So there's a large body of research on colour term acquisition and how children learn the words for colour. And the general discourse of that research has been that learning colour words is effortful for children, that it takes a long time, and that it's perhaps a special case relative to other kinds of language. However, the work of Katie Wagner has really turned that theory on its head a bit. So Katie did this really nice research where she analysed the errors that children make before they've actually learnt all the colour terms. What errors do they make when they're naming colours? And she shows that even though it looks like the children don't know their colour words, there seems to be a categorical structure to the errors that they're making, an underlying structure. So for example, this child here, pink and purple are given the same name, and black, brown and grey are all given the same name, and yellow and orange are given the same name. So there's some kind of structure there. It's just that they're struggling to learn the category boundaries of their own specific language. There's also research suggesting that colour is categorised before colour terms from infant studies. So much of my early work was investigating infant colour categorisation using a number of different tasks. And this has been shown, categorical response to colour in infants has been shown in a number of studies across various labs. First of all, from the classic work of Mark Bornstein, but a number of other labs as well. In this study, we were interested in finding out how infants' colour categories relate to the world's colour lexicons. So why is it that languages vary so much in their colour categories and their colour terms if infants are categorising colour? So to understand this, we took this stimulus grid, the Munsell stimulus grid, from the World Colour Survey. So that was a survey of 110 of the world's non-industrialised colour lexicons. And we systematically sampled stimuli along a row of this stimulus grid. And then we paired them and used this novelty preference method to measure infants' response to those colour pairs. So novelty preference is a well-established method in infant science. And the general idea is that you show one stimulus repeatedly, and the more you show it, the less the infant looks because they've encoded it. And then you pop in a novel colour and you look to see how long they look at that novel colour. Now, if they look longer at the novel than the familiar colour, then their colour memory must be distinguishing those two colours. However, if they treat them equivalently, if they look equally, then they're not showing evidence that they're distinguishing them in their recognition memory. So the definition of categorization is that you treat discriminably different stimuli as if they're equivalent. So a lack of novelty preference is showing color categories on this task. So here are the novelty preference results that we get. In a nutshell, we find that infants distinguish hues on this task in their recognition memory at certain points in the color spectrum. So those we'd call the category boundaries, but that in other regions, even though the colors are very different and we know that infants can discriminate them on other tasks, when we test them with this memory task, they treat those colors as if they're equivalent. So you can see this categorical structure forming. Now, when we plot the stimuli in the cone-opponent space, we also see the basis of these categories. So what we find is that the adaptation point on the cardinal axes, so the grey background that they've adapted to on these two neural mechanisms, provides a fault line for infants to categorize color on this colour memory task. And that accounts for all of the category boundaries apart from this one between yellow and red here. So in other words, infants' colour categorisation is based on sensory mechanisms of colour vision. How
Anna,
is it?
5 minutes? 5 minutes,
Oh,
Anna?
okay, crikey. I'll speed up then. So we also looked at how these were related to the world's colour lexicons. So here, this is analysis from Kay and Regier, where they've plotted the centre of the world's colour terms. You can see they form these clusters. And what we find is that infant colour categories tend to align with those clusters as well. So it's possible that sensory mechanisms could explain the commonality that comes out in the world's colour lexicons. Another phenomenon that can be traced back to infancy is colour preference. So it's established that adults prefer some colours more than others. For example, blue is very commonly preferred, and this dark yellow green is commonly disliked. Now, when we record infants' looking time at individually presented colours, it also relates to how much adults like those colours. So over half of the variance can be explained. So infants look longer at colours that adults like. And again, this can be accounted for partially by the sensory mechanisms of colour vision. So here you can see that the S cardinal axis of colour vision is accounting for some of the variation in both infant looking and adult liking. And there's a nice study by Angela Brown and Del Lindsay, where they further show how you can model infants' visual preference for colour using the sensory mechanisms of colour vision. So the proposal here is that infants have these initial sensory biases to colour that make them look longer at some colours than others, but that as they develop and as they interact with objects and the world around them, that colour preference become modulated by these cultural and object influences, such that by the time you're a child, you can also get these very stereotyped sex differences in colour preference. So this is Jiong Mi's Pink and Blue project, and since 2005 she's been photographing children with their possessions, and it gives us these really striking images which show us just how strong the sex difference in colour preferences in childhood. And there's a study by LeBeau and Deloach which shows that these sex differences in colour preference actually arise around about 2.5 years of age, when children start to develop sex stereotype behaviour. We also need to consider neurodiversity in the development of colour perception, and a body of work has investigated that in individuals with autism. So, for example, in one of our case studies, we discussed the case of a child, JG, who had such a strong preference for blue that he coloured his dog blue, and he only ever drove in, would only ever be driven in blue cars. There's also atypical colour preferences. So in autism, things like yellow, for example, that are typically liked less, and brown, which is typically a disliked colour in neurotypical participants, is liked more. And then there's a cluster of studies which suggest that colour discrimination is poorer in autism as well. There's another set of studies by John Moore in investigating colour perception in adults with autism, and that finds also some differences in colour perception. For example, adults with autism under some conditions are less good at getting the gist of a multicoloured ensemble, but they're better at retaining the identity, the colour of the individual elements. So to summarise, we find rudimentary forms of colour preference at just 4 months. So the sensitivity to colour and its relationship with the environment, colour preference and colour categorisation can all be traced back to infancy in a kind of rudimentary form. We also see protracted maturation of colour perception. So for example, colour discrimination takes up until adolescence to mature. Colour constancy also continues to develop throughout childhood. And this development provides insight into the nature of colour perception and cognition. So I hope I've shown that a developmental approach enables us to disentangle the relative contribution of biology, culture, and experience to our experience of colour. And of course, it also tells us about perceptual development more generally. So there's application to this research. So most recently, we've applied this research to develop a new test of colour blindness for children. We've called this Colour Spot, and it's a gamified app which is designed for iPads. We've colour calibrated all the models of iPads, and it measures saturation thresholds along proton, deuteron, and triton axes. In other words, axes which would diagnose colour blindness. We've validated it by testing 800 4 to 7-year-old boys and show that the test has greater sensitivity and specificity than any other available test when used with young children. And we're currently seeking regulatory approval. So our goal is that parents and teachers will be able to download this app and actually identify whether their child is colourblind. And that's needed because a lot of countries across the world no longer have school screening programs for colour blindness. So it's a very underdiagnosed condition. We've also applied our research by working with various companies. So, for example, we did a study looking at the effect of colour on children's performance in the classroom. And we've worked with drama companies to design drama and art that's optimised for infant and child vision. And then we've also been working with companies that design products for babies or books for babies to ensure that the colours on those products and books can actually be seen. So finally, just to acknowledge the European Research Council, who generously funded my research over the last decade, and all of the team of the 3 projects that cover the research that I've talked about today. And in particular, I'd like to recognise Alice Skelton's a brilliant postdoctoral researcher in the lab who's done many of the infant studies that from our lab that I presented today. And then finally, we've just had a review out in Child Development Perspectives on infant colour perception for anyone interested in reading more. And then we've got another review on the development of colour perception in the annual review of psychology that's coming out next year. So if anyone fancies a read, then send me an email and I can send you a copy when it's out. Thanks very much.